Shalom everyone. We're about to study page 15, Tractate Bava Metzia. Did you ever have the misfortune to be a tourist in a foreign country and you feel strongly that people there are taking advantage of you? Issues between seller, buyer, customers, and different type of fraud is the key issue we're going to discuss today. Our Torah tells us, "V'chi timkeru mimkar la'amitecha." When you are in a selling product, can be retail, wholesale, or any form of sale, lo tonu ish et achiv. We are prohibited to take advantage, use misappropriation of fund in any form of embezzlement, fraud, and exploitation, and more. When exactly you say that the one party took advantage of the other? Trace a situation. If, let's say, Abraham owns a store and David walk out of gorgeous, beautiful car, well-dressed, and the price for that product was $20. But David noticed that Abraham is a fellow with apparently a lot of wealth, and he charged him $50 instead of $20. How you treated the situation the other way? When David walked into Abraham and he said to him, "You want to charge me so and so, I have another offer for much less," turns out to be untruth statement. So the idea of exploitation and fraud, taking advantage of others, can go in both ways, in both parties. So who, what, where, when, and how, we're going to discuss. When do we say that is no deal? When do we say that it is a deal, but only in a certain term and conditions? And when we say that it's absolutely done deal? How do we interpret the dynamic of numbers between the two parties? When do we say that that's the market value and is a fixed price? When do we say that that fellow take advantage of the others? What exactly the numbers in percentage we hold that it's already crossed the line, when it's within the line, and when it's okay because customer will swallow it? That's the nature of the beast, that's the market. So before we start studying the Mishnah, which is on page 49b, let's use some examples. So the concept of al tonu, you should not deceive each other, is crucial before we go in the Mishnah and the Gemara and Halacha to understand the concept. There are several words that publicly use, can be scam, can be, in Hebrew you call it okets, like sting, some type of sting scam or some form of deception. So our first scenario, Abraham has a store and a product that he usually sells for $20, he asked David, who looks very well-to-do person, for $50. That's, on the surface, is gezel gamur. That's a definitely form of, you can use a nice word like robbery or thief, or you can say deception or fraud. But the key is, you cannot charge more than the fair market price. It is true that in many countries, in many places, there is a tourist price. You charge a local peasant, people who live around a certain number, but outside tourists, you charge a different price. Or sometimes you go to a place like hospital like a big public place, pharmacy, they charge a exuberant amount of price. That's the market. Sometimes people are under pressure, they need something immediately, can be even just a water. And all of a sudden, I saw once they charge for a bottle of water $7.50, while we all know how much a box of 24 bottles costs. So we're going to learn three different Mishnaic definitions of deception or form of fraud, when it's considering one and when it's not. But it can go the other way around as well. In a reverse way, David go to Abraham, who is, for our discussion, has a transportation company. He transporting people from one location to another all over the country. David started negotiation with Abraham and he said, oh, you wanted me to have my people transfer like 25 people on a bus for a price of so and so. I can get half of that from a different vendor that offer me half of that. So obviously, it's also considering some type of exploitation or fraud. Why? Because if it is not true, then you're just taking advantage of the fact, you assume that the other party is not going to check out, and maybe the other party is under pressure and they need to get more business, and you're just pushing them in a certain way without giving the proper background. Again, if David did the homework and he showed, look, I did the homework and that's what this company, that company charged me and I want so and so, it's a different story. But as we all know, just to walk to a store without intent to purchase, just to see what's the bottom line of the seller, is prohibited. There is a concept of shuk paruts, meaning you have a situation that the, let's say, construction people, construction companies, and the price is kind of total wide for painting or other constructions work. So as long as it's not mechiron, as long as it's not a very clear-cut price list that involved with certain product, the business is a business. You agree between the party, he agreed to give you the service, you agree to pay. When we say that the deal is abrogated, it's total annul, we need to go to a nitty-gritty point. For example, it can be sometimes that the deal is deal and the deal is done. However, you have to return the other party what you overcharge. So the deal can be a done deal, yet we interfere and said, since you overcharge that portion, you have to return. So the big question is, when do we say the deal is done, and when do we say that, what exactly the market price? How you establish the market price? If it's more than the market price or less than market price, it can be some type of exploitation, hona'ah, can be to the purchaser, can be to the seller. The general rule, before we enter that understanding, is if the seller deceives the buyer, meaning if he overcharged more than the proper price, we need to examine what is considering more. And we said in a very general term, it's called shishit, which means 1/6 of the value of the merchandise. So here is the word, I'm quoting the Shulchan Aruch, the code in Choshen Mishpat 227. What is the sum of the disparity in price between the market value of an item and the price at which it was sold that one will be required to return the exploited party? The answer is, it is a disparity of 1/6 of the value of the merchandise. So it means in the modern days language is 16.6% more than the market price. So, very general term is Adam Mochel, a person can let go if it's below the 16.6, and is no need to return the sum to the other party, to the purchasers. But there are still early Rishonim, early rabbis that said that it's prohibited, but the deal is still in effect. You do not need to return the money. Again, sometimes is a Hebrew words, it's called kasher aval masriach, which means it is kosher, but it stinks, right? It's not right. So here, the deal can be okay, there's no need to return the money, but still some rabbis argue that it's not right. So let's sum up our understanding. 16.6% is the crucial part that makes a difference in the deal. When we said it's hona'ah, it's exploitation, is the form of deception, and the mekach batel umevutal, the deal is total, void and null, and you need to return the money, it's when it's reached that point onward, above 16.6. Above 16.6, העסקה בטלה. The deal is no longer in effect. So here is our Mishnah Kedusha. The Mishnah tells us, and it's important to know based on what we said in Vayikra 25, the idea of lo tonu, you should not take advantage or cheat it, applies regardless if it was intentional or unintentional. The Mishnah said, ההונאה 4 כסף מ-24 כסף לסלע. The measure of exploitation for which one can claim that he was exploited is 4 silver me'ah from the 24 silver me'ah on a seller. Meaning, in that sense, you can call it dollar, you can call it euro. We just use the term that used in those days. A fellow enter, let's say, modern days to a change place, changing money. He wants to purchase, they call it seller. You pick the currency you wish to. He doesn't want a small change, he doesn't want small money. So they ask for 24 silver in exchange of seller. So it means if the exploitation was 4 silver more, and he said, I want 28 instead of 24, so the 4, it's considering 1/6, and you need to return the 1/6. So what does that mean the seller needs to return? Is that a debt? Is that a chov? So it's all depend on the scenario. They said here, ההונאה 4 כסף מ-24 כסף לסלע, שטות למיקח. So it's 1/6 of the transaction. The next question is, how long? עד מתי מותר להחזיר? For how long, until when it is permitted for the buyer to return the item? You know, in modern days, we have a customer service, they return an item. How far we can go with it? So in general, we can say a very general term, it's like half an hour, like 30 minutes. All of a sudden, I search, it turns out that it's not right, and I return to the store and I want my money back. עד כדי שיראה לתגר או לקרובו. So it means about, we use the term of 30 minutes, but only until a period of time has passed that he will allow him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative who is more familiar with the market price of the merchandise. If more time has elapsed, he can no longer return the item, as the assumption is that he waived his right to receive the sum of the disparity. Now, There's a question in Halakha that many rabbis ask: how do you deal with the companies that have this called motag? That means that they establish a reputation of a certain names. Certain companies, they have name. Not necessarily better product, how far you go with hona'ah, of exploitation. So let's say if the way that one party exploited the other party less than 1/6, let's say if the buyer, the lakoach, have 6 instead of 7, meaning the seller wants, let's say, $7 and he gets it in a $6, that's pachot mishishi, that's less than 16.6%. So here, soon you see a disputation between Rav and Shmuel, but let's first finish the Mishnah. הורה רבי טרפון בלוד ההונאה 8 כסף, מ-24 כסף לסלע, שליש למיקח וסמכו תגרי לוד. So here you have a very interesting situation. We all know Rabbi Tarfon, a great man. He ruled in the city Lod. Exploitation is a measure of 8 silver me'ah from the 24 silver me'ah of a seller, 1/3 of the transaction, and the margin of law rejoiced because the ruling allowed them a greater profit margin and rendered the nullification of a transaction less likely. So because they feel that way, they are happy, but all of a sudden Rabbi Tarfon Amar Lahem, Rabbi Tarfon add to that a very important statement that it caused them to change their mind. He said to them, throughout the entire day, Kol Hayom mutar lachazor. The entire day it is permitted to renege on the transaction and not merely for the period of time it takes to show the purchase item to a merchant or relative. So when they hear that, all of a sudden, אמרו לו, יניח לנו רבי טרפון במקומנו וחזרו לדבר חכמים. So they heard that, they said, you know what, Rabbi Tarfon, leave us alone, that's where we are, and the previous ruling, and they reverted to the following, the statement of the sages in the Mishnah with regard to both ruling, which means up to the 16.6 ad shishit, 1/6, is not considering hana'ah. There is a derivative from that in the poskim, in the great rabbis, for example, the late Rabbi Moshe Weisblum. What do you do with va'adeh ovdim? What do you do with the enactment or ruling of board? Can be board of trustees, board of governors, that rule a certain way. Apparently, ostensibly, they have the power to change. Here you see from the story of the merchant in law makes a difference. So, as you see, this form of exploitation or deception can go both ways. Can go seller to buyer, buyer to seller. Now, what exactly you define the 1/6? So, it is stated that there is an Amoraic disputation in regards to exploitation. Itmar Rav Amar Shtut Mikach Shaninu, Ushmuel Amar Shtut Ma'ot Namei Shaninu. So here is different between Rav and Shmuel. If the purchaser basically took a situation advantage of the other party and get him to sell, let's say, something that the seller wants $7 for $6. So Rav said whatever he put the other side, that the 1/6 of the purchase item, it's not 1/6 of the money that paid. So that's Rav's view. Shmuel said no. It can be fluctual. The exploitation is also determined by 1/6 of the money paid, which means it can be 1/4/6, meaning the 1/6, it's like 16.6%, that's what purchase, so you need to return the money. So if, let's say, if item is $20 and the charge was $24, right? The person wants $24 and the purchaser convinced him to sell it for $20. So $4 is the 1/6. From what? From 24. So this, the disputation between Rabbi and Shmuel, what exactly the determined fact? The mekach, the transaction, or because if you measure the transaction, it can be less than 1/6, but if the amount that was paid was 1/6, that's basically rules. If the purchaser caused the seller to sell it from $6 or even $5, so that's 1/6 and he needs to return. We always measure it in exchange of the others. So let's say item worth $5, the seller sell it for $6, the deal was in $5, so you go by 1 in exchange of the 1/6. Now, the way we put it together is if it's less than 1/6, less than 16.6%, so the Mishnah said that the deal is done. Neither party can abrogate the deal, but later the Gemara said if still one of the parties can ask for reimbursement for the money of the exploitation. Halachically speaking, the deal is done, and no one can claim against the other. The question is, what do you do if it's a shtut, if it's exactly the amount of 16.6, of 1/6? So the other party that feels that he took advantage, he can back out the deal, or he can sue and require to compensate for the difference of the money that was the may hona'ah, the money that he was feel was cheated or stole. But halacha speaking, the deal is done, but the one who basically took advantage of can claim against the other party for the difference in price. If it's a more than shtut, if it's more than 1/6, more than 16.6, then the deal is null and void, and either one of the parties, either the purchaser or the seller, can change their mind. Halacha is the deal is void, and either party can back out the deal. Now our Gemara elaborates on this disputation. שווה שיטה בחמשה, שווה שיטה בשבעה, כולי עלמא לא פליגי דבתר מכך אז לינה. So when it's come to someone who sells something that is worth 6 in 5, I'm just using dollar or euro, right? $6, he basically sold it for 5, and the other way around, shaveh shita, an item that worth, let's use just $6 that was sold for 7. So in one case, the seller was kind of deceived. The other one, the purchaser, the buyer, deceived. Kulei alma lo plige, everyone agreed, both parties agrees that the batar mikach azrina, that we follow the transaction, which means when you have the fraction of the variation in price is determined relative to the market value of the item sold. And that's what we said earlier. It's so important to understand that, as Rashi and others explained to us, that the terms hona'ah, the term of some type of fraud or deception, is misconception or misconstruing the value of the item. So it's all depend upon the real market value of the price. So how do you evaluate shtut? 16.6%, 1/6. Tosfot said, because there is a fine agreement over the market, the real market price, the real price of, so that's basically the value that they take. Kiplige, the disputation between this Rav and Shmuel is שווה 5 בשיטה ושווה 7 בשיטה. If you have something that value $5 that was sold for 7, or something that worth 7 was sold for 6. So it means that one, let's say dollar, those days was zuz, that was basically a fracture, was not the real one. It's not 1/6 in connection to the real market value, but more or less, which is more something that is 5 went to be 6, or something that it's much less, something that's 7 that was sold for 6. So it means that it's 1/6 from the original price, which is the 6 zuz, the $6 in both cases. So therefore, Li Shmuel, according to the view of Shmuel, the Amar Batar Ma'ot Askinan, that he said that we follow the fracture of the variation in price as determined by the money paid. So it means that we also go by the actual price, Idi ve'idi hona'a have, which means both cases are exploitation, because it's the disparity of 1/6 between the price paid and the value of the item, even that was more or less from the real fair price. However, Rav de Amar Batar Mikach Askinan, but if you go by the view of Rav, who says that we follow the transaction when an item worth 5 sell for 6, so therefore you go here and you said Shaveh Hamsha B'Shita Bitul Mikach Avia. This is a total nullification of the transaction, because the disparity between the value of the item and the price paid is greater than shishit, is greater than 1/6. Rabbeinu Asher have a big quandary here. His predicament is, what is the chazakah? Do you have a status of mechila, that average person let go when it's a normal manner of mekach umimkar, of transaction? You cannot go by the super exact number. So what exactly al tonu, what exactly the verse in the Torah in Vayikra 25, you shall not do any form of exploitation one to another, but by force or circumstance you doesn't need to pay, because the assumption is the other party will let go. The question is, what exactly the definition of mechila, especially if the other party is not aware? Ushmuel Amar, but according to Shmuel, why he disputed Rav in this? Ki amrinan mechila ubitul mikach. When Shmuel said that there is a waiver of nullification of the transaction, heicha deleika shtut mishne tzdadim, when there is not disparity of 1/6 from both in the terms of the money paid and the term of the value of the item. So it means not because of the real price, the real market price, or not in the sense of the item that they agree upon in real when it happens to the transaction. אבל היכא דאיכא שטות מצד אחד, but in a case that there is a disparity of 1/6 from one aspect, either in terms of money paid or in the value of the item, then hona'ah, yeah, that's already a fraud, it's exploitation, and that's treated as an archtut. Based on that, the contemporary halachic rabbis have a discussion how you treated, for example, people who works on a daily basis, paid by the day. Do you hold dinei hona'ah, do you hold the law of exportation the same way? Why? Because if you treated, let's say, a professional, let's say a painter, plumber, barber, okay, you treat it as a estate, we know that אין hona'ah לקרקעות. There is no term of exploitation with the estate. So for example, when you hire a painter, he works per day, per job. So it's involved a lot of details. There's the tools and much more details involved. So you have application of dinei hona'ah. It's a big discussion based on Gemara. Now the Gemara tried to bring a proof of the view of Shmuel from our Mishnah. Tznan. We learn in the Mishnah, ha-hona'ah, when it's come to the measure of some type of fraud, depending how you look. Here it's called exploitation, for which one can claim that he is exploited, is what? 4 כסף מ-24 כסף לסלע. 4, those days they had silver, right? 4 silver me'ah from the 24 silver me'ah in sela. Shtut lamikach. So shtut, as we said, is 16.6%, which is 1/6 of the transaction. מה אליו בזבין שווה 20 ב-24? We are not speaking about a case when he bought an item worth 20 me'ah for 24 me'ah, which means that it's 1/5, it's 20% of the value, but it's 16.6 from the price that he really paid for. Ushma mina, we derive from here, shtut ma'ot name shaninu. We derive from here that it's also determined by 1/6 of the money paid. That's follow the view of Shmuel. And the Gemara rejected that. They said, לא, דזבן שווה 24 ב-20. It's a case where he sold an item worth 24 me'ah for 20. So here is from the mekach, not from the ma'ot. So the Gemara asks, minit ana, if so, who was exploited in the transaction? Mocher, you can say it was the seller. Why? Because he received less than what he is entitled to. Eima seifa, let's look at the last part of the Mishnah. Ad motai mutar lehachazir. Until when it is permitted for the buyer to return the item and ask and claim for the money of the exploitation, בכדי שיראה לתגר או לקרובו, meaning the time that the buyer have enough to go, let's say half an hour, to go and he is going to show it to another merchant or to his relative, and he asks, is that fair price or the guy took advantage of me and fooled me, right? So if the time, let's say a half an hour pass, he cannot come back and claim anymore, meaning that he will let go of the being exploited. The Rav Nachman commented on that and said, Lo shanu, the limitation, the idea that we are very limited with time, that's applied to what? Ela lokeach. That's applied to what? To the buyer who is in his possession of the item and can show it to the merchant immediately. Aval mocher. But if it was a seller that was fooled, and he may always renege on the transaction. לעולם חוזר. Why? חפץ לא אצלו. He doesn't have the item. The purchased item is not in his possession. So the seller can determine its market price only if it happens to encounter a similar item. Now, therefore is no time frame within which this will certainly happen. So you can't tell me that he sold something that worth 20 but instead by 20. Ela, now we go the different avenue that follows the view of Rav. דזבן שווה 24 ב-28. That the Mishnah meant when he sold something that worth 24 in 28. So therefore the purchaser exposed the exploitation for 16.6 for 1/6 from the real value of the item. Tnan, we learn in the Mishnah, Hora Rabbi Tarfon belod. So we learn in the Mishnah that Rabbi Tarfon ruled in the city of Lod. ההונאה 8 כסף, מ-24 כסף לסלע, שליש למיקח. Exploitation is a measure of 8 silver me'ah, from 24 silver me'ah of sela, 1/3 of the transaction. Tosfot ask, why the Gemara needs to repeat the question we asked already in the Mishnah, and you see that point in other Mefarshim. But anyway, my love, what exactly we discuss here? דזבין שווה שצרי ב-24. He sold something that worth 16 for 24, which means the exploitation was half of the value of that item, but 1/3 from the price that they agreed in the final act of payment. So therefore, ushma mina, and we derive from here, shlish ma'ot namei shaninu, that the 1/3 of the money paid, that's the view of view of Shmuel, and that's basically ona'at shlish, 1/3, according to Rabbi Tarfon. So the same way as Rabbi Tarfon said that we evaluate by the shlish, 1/3 of the real market value that they agreed. So the same way as the sages agreed that it's 1/6 by the price that both agree upon originally. The Gemara rejected that and said, no, לא, דזבין שווה 24 בשצה. Guess what happened? It was a situation that was sold, item that worth 24 for amount of 16. That means that the exportation was in a value of 1/3 of the real value of the item, and not from the ma'ot, but mekach, and therefore we do not have a proof for Shmuel from here. So the Gemara asks, wait a second, minit ana, who is the one who exploited in this transaction? Mocher, you tell me that it is the seller. Why? Because he received less than what he is entitled to. Let's look at the last clause of the Mishnah. Amar lahem, Rabbi Tarfon said to those merchants of the city of Lod, Kol hayom, the entire day of that business transaction, mutar lachazor. The entire day it is permitted to renege the transaction. So, what we derive from here? We derive from here that the buyer can change his mind and ask for his money back and nullify the deal. Rav Nachman says, לא שנו אלא לוקח, אבל בוחר לעולם חוזר. All this halacha applies to what? To the buyer. But when it's come to the seller may always renege on the transaction. So it means that you have to say that the Mishnah speaks about what? The purchaser that was exploited. Meaning, you cannot say that he sold something that worth 24 in 16. So now the Gemara offer another avenue that follows the view of Rav. אלא דזבן שווה 24 בתלתין ותרי. That he sold an item that worth 24 me'ah for 32 me'ah. So all the point that we prove from Rabbi Tarfon and the way we rejected it, that's equivalent to what Tana Kamma said and we rejected it. Tosfot asked why you need all of that, and Yoshua explained it. Let's continue. And by the way, there is a contemporary poskim that have a discussion. If a person walks to a store that is considering a kind of a fancy or well-maintained store, they have a beautiful display, music and everything, and you realize that there are many items they sell and you can find 2 blocks away for like huge difference in price. All of a sudden he see one of his friends walking there, a very gullible person, who about to pay a fortune for all those prices of the item in that fancy store. The question is that Hashavat Avida? Is that okay to go and tell him? Is that Shon Hara? Can you tell him that you're crazy to buy it here and to buy it in such expensive way? Do you have the law of exploitation in that case? Based on Gemara, there is a discussion among the poskim. So now the Gemara bring a praita that proved the view of Shmuel. Tanya Kvartei de Shmuel. How? מי שהוטל עליו ידוע לעליונה. So here you have one upon whom the exploitation was imposed has the advantage. כיצד? Give me a scenario. מכר לו שווה 5 ב6. So if the case that sold him item that worth 5 for 6. So Rashi explained that's basically an Achtut, the 1/6 from the agreed price. Minit ana, who is the one who exploited? Lokeach, this is the buyer. The buyer is an advantage. Why? Because he paid 1 more than it should, right? Yad lokeach ala elyona. The buyer is an advantage point. Why? Ratza omer, if he wishes, he can say to the seller, tell me mautai, give me back my money, and I'll return the item to you. So that's by the follow the Mishnah. That even in an Achtut, even exploitation of 1/6, the one whose they feel that they took advantage of him, he can nullify the deal. And we remember the Ritva said that that's not the halacha, only when it's come to shtut onward. So then, but not total nullify the deal, but anyway. Or another option, he can say to him, tell me mashe onetani. So he can say to him, listen, give me back the sum which you receive by engaging in exploitation of me, which means that shishit me'amaot, 1/6 from the money, not only from the mekach. That's called hona'ah, exploitation. And therefore, if macharlo, where one sold him, page 50, shaveh 6 ב5 מי התענה? Rashi tells us, shtut mekach shaveh 5 ב6 shtut ma'ot. Meaning, if you take an item that worth 6, 4, 5, so who is the one who is exploited? mocher, the seller, why? He received one less than the one he's entitled. Yad mocher al ha'elyona. The seller is in advantage position, and therefore the seller had the option, רצה אומר לו, תן לי מקחי, או תן לי מה שעונתני. The seller can say to the buyer, either give me back my merchandise and nullify the transaction, and I'll return you money. Or he said, give me back the money which you received by engaging in exploitation of me, and that's it. Now, let's use a current example. Let's say Abraham, he was looking for a new bicycle. Not a regular one, but let's say one is used all these electronic tchotchkes. So he's not so familiar, but he wanted because of the traffic jam and the parking issues and more. So you go to the store, and the guy said to him, look, I have something from 250 to whatever, a lot. So he said to him, listen, I want something in the top quality and good. Now the seller knows, let's call the seller name Yitzchak, he knows that the prices for the market price is between, let's say, 250 to 1,000. But he noticed that Abraham looks very well-to-do person. So he said, okay, let me make some cutting corner and take advantage of him. So he said, you know how they said those who broker that willing to sell you Brooklyn Bridge and things like that. He said to him, usually it's much more, but for you, I'll sell this bicycle for $1,150. So hearing that, Abraham is extremely happy. He paid the $1,150 and he walked out. Half an hour later, he's back to Yitzchak's store, furious, livid, ready to take apart the whole store. What happened? Yitzchak asked him. He says, you fool me, you think I'm an idiot, you think I'm a fool, I'm not a moron, I know what's going on. I went to another store and I was also talking on the way to my relative and friends, and he took me to another store, and the guy said the same thing that you sold me, the same company, the same model, the same thing, it's for 1,000. And he said, under no circumstance any place can sell to you more than 1,000. So Yitzchak said to him, listen, I have to be truthful with you. It is true that in all the stores they're selling this bike between 250 to 1,000. So you're right, I shouldn't charge you more. But guess what? I checked the halacha, and guess what they said? They said shtut. And what is shtut? Is one, you remember that? We said that it's what? It's 16.6. So listen to this. So the moment I charge you more than 1,167, meaning I exceeded the 1/6 measure, therefore, as we explained, the deal is null and void, and it's not a deal. But since I charge you how much? 1,150. It is wrong of me to charge you more than 1,000. But since it's pachot mishtu, since it's less than 1/6, we assume that people in general are moichel, are let go, and therefore I'm sorry, I'll do teshuvah and everything else, but I'm not going to give you back the 150 because the deal is still in effect. In Hebrew there is a phrase for that. You hear me say it several times, כאשר אבל מסריח. It's okay, but it stinks. Anyway, those who cut corner, It's a story about one of the great Dayanim in Eretz Yisrael, whose name is Rav Grossman. And it was a fellow, several children that inherited an apartment. So in those days, the apartment was about a value of $90,000. One of the sons was an unscrupulous individual, so he went to the appraisal. And he said to the appraisal, listen, how much you charge for appraisal of apartment? He said, let's say $1,000. He says, listen, I'm giving you $5,000 if you going to write an appraisal instead of, let's say, 90,000, write 20,000 less, 70,000. Why? Because I want to buy out my other brother, so in this way, I'll make money. No, the appraiser himself was not the honest person, as sometimes happened. So he said, fine, you have a deal. So the appraiser went there and he appraised the apartment for 70 instead of 90. After he appraised it and the deal was over, that fellow gave him 1,000. So they both ran and screamed and yelled to Rabbi Grossman Besdin, stating that this one is a crook and this one fooled me and this one is a fraud. Now the question is, first and foremost, since the appraiser admitted to Rabbi Grossman that the real value of the apartment is 90, so it's a mitzvah of Hashavat Aveda. Apparently he needs to go to the other brother who accepts the idea of buying him out and tell him that that's not the truth, the number, that's much less. And the whole idea of this one crook and that one crook and this is buyout and this one promising 5 in exchange for himself, you have a big write-up about it. But the whole concept, as we said, is some unfortunate situation that people take and cutting all this corner in the law for their advantage. Before we continue on, there's a beautiful story I heard once about the Gero Rebbe, the Chidushei Arim. Ichemaya was one of the greatest Rabbein. The story goes that was a very wealthy individual that wanted his son to be married to the Rebbe's daughter. And people know that to marry the Rebbe's daughter, that's very unlikely. Only if you are so ingenious and brilliant, and because the minhag that the father-in-law go and have the test to the potential son-in-law to see how great Talmid Chacham is. So anyway, that very wealthy individual gave a lot of money to one of the matchmakers, and he said, you go to Chidushei Arim, you go to the Gero Rebbe and offer the shidduch. So the fellow paid him so much, he went there and he offered. And the Rebbe said, I don't have any prejudice for against anybody. I do a test. Bring him over, I'm testing. If he's good enough, good. So this very wealthy individual, he took his wagon and horses in those days, and he went with his son. His son said, how I can go there? He says, don't worry. And they traveled with the wagon and everything. In between, he saw a little Gemara, something in between, and it was a folding page. So he opened and figured out so many hours traveling until they reached the place that the Rebbe was located. And it was our sugya, Tagarei Lod, Bava Metzia, page 50. No, so he studied and studied and studied. He figured out, if I go there, I have something. So he get there and get before the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said to him, no, what sugya you study now? So he said, Tagarei Lod, Bava Metzia, page 50. Oh, Tagarei Lod, okay. Start having a discussion with him, and the boy knew amazingly. He asked him left and right, top and bottom, beautifully he knows. So, the Rebbe went ahead and he called the Shadchan. He said, you have a deal. He went to his family and he said, I want this man to be married to my daughter. Later on it turns out that's really the page that he knows. This was a very average, to say at least, person, but by force of circumstance, while they're traveling, that's what he learned out of scaredness. So the Chiddushei came out and he says, now you see how the concept of Shidduchim Mishamayim, that we can do all the ishtadlut and all the effort, but eventually it's the Almighty God who put together the Shidduchim, because look what happened. But anyway, it was this sugya. So this subject, this sugya, it's a well-known sugya. It's called Sugyat Tagarei Lod, as based on the Mishnah we learned, the negotiation and discussion of the margin of load in the ruling of Rabbi Tarfon and their reaction to his ruling. And what we said, that since the one who complained cannot file anything that it's below than 1/6, so therefore, because the assumption is that each party let go if it's below than 1/6, so here is a serious predicament, the serious dilemma presented when it's come to the law of exploitation. פחות משטות לרבנן לאלתר ומחילה ובכדי שיראה לתגר או לקרובו. Here, first there is a shita mekubetzet that asks why we challenging Rabbanan, but let's go by just the text itself. It says, if you go by the less than 1/6 according to the view of the Rabbanan, the sages, and not Rabbi Tarfon, if it was immediate mechila, meaning the moment we let go because it's below than 1/6, so even though the purchaser wants to back out immediately and claim against the seller, he cannot do it. Or you may say that that act of let go applies only after a period of time. And how long is that? בכדי שיראה לתגר או לכבודו או לקרובו. This is what? The time that it takes the buyer to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relatives. So as we said, it can be half an hour, 1 hour, but the idea is, prior to that, he is not let go, lo machal, and he can go and file a claim against the seller. Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, add to that. And he said, what's the difference? When it's come to a merchant tagar, when you go to ask another merchant, something that is unusual. Krovo is day by day. You go to your relative, you show them what you buy, and you ask them a question. So he said, Ve'im timtze lomar, if you come and say that it's actually clear that if it's an item that it was exploited less than 1/6, is considering that it's immediate forgiveness, and otherwise, בכדי שיראה לתגר או לקרובו, meaning there is a period of time in between. I'm just using a word of half an hour. The idea is there's a relatively short period of time that he needs to show to his relative or to a merchant. מהי איכא בין שטות לפחות משטות? So what's the real difference between a disparity of 1/6 and a disparity of less than 1/6? Because in both cases, the purchaser can go and file against the seller until that period of time passed, meaning up to that point he can do it, after that he cannot do it. Ika de'ilu shtut yado al העליונה, meaning there is a difference. In the case of disparity of 1/6, the one who's exploited has the advantage. Why? Because he, if he wishes, he reneges of the transaction, If he wishes, the buyer acquires the purchase item. רצה חוזר, רצה קונה ומחזיר הונאה. ואילו פחות משטות, if that exportation happened to be less than 1/6, and he backed out during that period of time, קנה ומחזיר הונאה, so he is basically acquired a purchase item, and the one who perpetrated the exploitation returns the sum gained through his exploiting the other, but there is no option of nullifying the transaction. So what exactly the law? So it means, Rashi explained, that the question, the predicament is basically when exactly the act of let go, the mechila, applies when it's case of exploitation that it's less than 1/6. Meaning, it's not the gufa mekach, the item itself, but the concept of when. If ha'im shi'ur mechila miyad, if the act of let go applies immediately, or until he asks his relatives. So there's a discussion among the poskim how you treated a situation that someone, let's say, just using an example, buy electronics. They buy a brand new expensive refrigerator. You get that refrigerator, gets to his house, it look, can be car, can be refrigerator, whatever it is. And all of a sudden he realized that there is a brand new, much nicer that just came out. So he figure out, let me look. He look around the refrigerator, and all of a sudden he noticed that there is a minor touch or defect in one of the back door or side door. Now the truth of the matter, this guy just want to have the brand new, beautiful model. So he is calling and driving Meshugit, the store or the company. He want them to take the refrigerator and bring them the new one. Is that considering honah or not? Because actually what happened when he picked up the car or refrigerator or whatever it is, he brought it to himself. An hour, 2 or 5 later, he decided, since he heard that there's a brand new model that's much nicer and much beautiful that just came out, and that's the reason why, the true reason why he wants to return it. But in order to cover himself up, he finds something that is not good. Is that considering a level of hona'ah, exploitation or not? The poskim have a discussion based on our sugya. So anyway, back to our subject. So the Gemara tried to reconcile this dilemma. Tashma, come and hear a resolution of the dilemma from the Mishnah. Tashma chazru ledivrei chachamim. So we try to reconcile that dilemma by saying that those merchant of load, they go back to the view of the sages, meaning when they heard from Rabbi Tarfon that it's not only a fellow can go ahead, the purchaser, and ask his relatives or fellow merchant, but this the whole daytime period. Upon hearing that, the merchant of Lord said, forget it, we go by the sages. There are several halachic implications and questions based on that. Basic question, especially for people who travel overseas. You see a price in the window, you see a price on a produce, you see the price of a clothing. You go and you pay, and all of a sudden, after you've been charged, you realize that these are all kind of VAT and other taxes that you never even realized that that's what's involved. So you saw originally the clothing for $25 and all of a sudden you are paying $34. So you said that's exploitation. Honah. Is that correct or incorrect? Another question. Let's say a unfortunately I have experience with that as well. You go to a fancy restaurant in a city, Upper West Side Manhattan. Now I can confess that I don't go those places only when people ask me to, for some reason, to join them in those glad kosher places, but it's crazy expensive in those places. But I noticed something in many places that it, in a way, disturbed me greatly, and since I saw it in too many places, I think this is the right place to refer to that. So, there is a price, and there is a price. What do you mean by that? So the guy invites lunch, me and another fellow. All of a sudden, I look at the check, and it's like $350 for lunch. Okay, I'm not paying that, it's not mine, but I looked and I noticed that they wanted tip. You know, tip is abbreviation of to insure pronto. Go to the Englishman's story. But anyway, now the trick they played in some restaurants is they incorporate the original tip with the price. And if you don't check the bill carefully, you can give tip on the tip. How do you like that? Meaning, you have a price of a product, and each product, you accumulated it for, let's say, $290, and then they put, let's say, average 15 to 25%. So imagine for the lunch, the guy is about to pay another $50, $60 for tip. But on the top of that, when he gets the bill, you see a few empty lines, and it means that if you want to pay tip, you can pay tip, and only later on, if you're not smart enough to check everything before you sign, you can pay double tip. Well, is that hana'ah? Go and figure. Anyway, Savua, so the students of the Beit HaMidrash thought to reconcile this dilemma from our Mishnah. פחות משליש לרבי טרפון כפחות משטות לרבנן דמי. Meaning, we have our sages' assumption that the legal status of a disparity of less than 1/3, according to the view of Rabbi Tarfon, who hold that 1/3 is the correct one for the disparity, is like the disparity of less than 1/6, according to the sages. So it's important to understand that there are three different difference between Rabbi Tarfon and the sages. According to Rabbi Tarfon, less than 1/3, the deal is valid and no one can back out. If it was exactly 1/3, so the one who took advantage of can nullify the deal or ask for his money back, or if it's above the 1/3, each of the party can nullify the deal. Versus, according to the sages, if it was less than shtut 1.66, deal is done and neither one can change his mind. If it was shtut 1.6, the one who claimed took advantage can nullify the deal or ask his money back. And if it's above shtut, above the 1.6, each of them can back out. Tosfot and others expand on that. So therefore, the claim is as follows: I amart bishlama pachot mishtut lerabanan, bichdei sheyar'e letaga o lekrovo. If you follow the view of the sages, that less than 1/6, according to the view of the sages, the buyer can claim exploitation only in the time it takes for him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative. And according to Rabbi Tarfon, kol hayom, so he can claim anytime, mishum hachei chazru. So therefore, that's the reason that the merchant of Lod reverted the following statement of the sages, as there was some benefit to them in following the opinion of the sages. So originally they are happy when they heard what Rabbi Tarfon said, that the measurement of exploitation is what? Is 1/3. And why they changed for the sages? Because originally they're happy, they figure out that the only way to claim is exploitation from 1/6 to 1/3, because according to the sages, any type of exploitation, it has to be 1.66 or more. Then he can back out during the time of show his, like let's say half an hour, show his relative or fellow merchant and nullify the deal. According to Rabbi Tarfon, he said that the 1/3, the deal is done, and he only can ask for his money back. So therefore, he ruled that the purchaser can go and ask for the money that he was taking advantage of during the entire day, and therefore it's much more potential of loss for the merchant of Lod. Because according to the sages, 1.66 and less, it's limited that, let's say, half an hour that he show his relative or fellow merchants. According to Rabbi Tarfon, you have the entire day. Rashi expanded that. Rashi said that according to the sages, it's better for them that the time is restrained, and therefore it's better for them to go that direction. However, if you say in a case of disparity of less than 1/6, according to the sages, the waiver is in effect and the transaction is finalized immediately. 50b, Rabbi Tarfon nami le'altar have mechila. So according to the view of Rabbi Tarfon, there is a waiver of the disparity of less than 1/3 and transaction is finalized. So therefore, the question is, Amai chazru? What's the story? Why the Garei Lod, the merchant of Lod, they revert the statement of, they move from the supporting the view of Rabbi Tarfon, they return back to the view of the sages, meaning Rabbi Tarfon said that the entire day the purchaser can back out, so they turn back to the view of Chachamim, of sages. But the Rabbi Tarfon nicha lehu tfei, lichora, apparently, the view, the ruling of Rabbi Tarfon, it should be better for them. Demai de Rabbanan Kamma shvu lehu anaha. Because if you go by the view of Rabbanan, of the sages deem exploitation, meaning a disparity of 1/6, is waived according to the view of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon havya mechila. So it's basically immediately. The moment is up to 1/3, and is no claim against the seller. Meaning, even though from 1/3 and onward, the sages are lenient with the seller, that they allow the purchaser to revert the decision until he showed to another merchant. And Tosfot explained that according to Rabbi Tarfon, he can change his mind for the entire day, but Tosfot goes and explains that it's very unlikely the level of exploitation will be so far. So the idea is that it will be an immediate waiver, immediate mechila. So the apparent understanding of our Mishnah, as our Gemara explained at this point, is the whole idea of exploitation up to 1/3 by Rabbi Tarfon is equal to up to 1/6 by the sages. Now, the question is, misavart. The Gemara rejected that and said, פחות משליש לרבי טרפון כפחות משטות לרבנן דמי? Do you really believe that the legal status of a disparity of less than 1/3, according to the view of Rabbi Tarfon, is like the legal status of a disparity of less than 1/6, according to the view of the sages? No, משטות ועד שליש, from 1/6 until 1/3, לרבי טרפון כשטות עצמה לרבנן דמי. So according to the view of Rabbi Tarfon, is like the legal status of a disparity of 1/6 itself, according to the view of the sages. And the party that was exploited received the portion of the exploitation in return. So the Gemara asked, and the Ritva Ed, and they said, what the Mishnah said that Rabbi Tarfon rules that apply to exploitation, meaning that the measure is 1/6. That Rabbi Tarfon said no, it's not 1/6. It can go further up to 1/3. So the Gemara said, Ihachi. If that's the case, meaning that the Rabbi Tarfon disagree with the sages is only for the shi'ur bitul hamekach, for the framework of when the deal is void, but he agreed that the exploitation begins with 1/6. B'may samchu me'ikara. What reason did the merchant of Lord rejoice initially? Because they gained nothing relative to the ruling of the sages. Tifshot, you have to resolve that the idea is the bitul mikach lerabanan leolam chozer. That according to the view of the sages, a case of nullification of the transaction, it can be forever, always, reneged of the transaction, and consequently, the Kevan de Amar lehu Rabbi Tarfon Havya onaha Samchu, since Rabbi Tarfon said to them that a disparity between 1/6 and 1/3 is merely exploitation, so they rejoice, because this will mean that the buyer has only time it takes to show the merchandise, a merchant or a relative, to renege. That's a great gain, the Ritva said. Because even though that from 1/6 and less they did not gain anything according to Rabbi Tarfon, but still they have this gain. כי אמר להו כל היום חזרו. Rabbi Tarfon came back and said to them, listen, the exploit person can renege on the transaction for the entire day, then they backed out. So it means the difference is not such a great difference. יסלקא דתך דביטול מיקח לרבנן בכדי שיראה לתגר לקרובו. Because if you tell me that the nullification of the transaction according to the sages is limited only to the time that it takes to show the merchandise, the margin is relative. So the question is, b'may samchu, what's the reason that the merchant of law rejoice of the Rabbi Tarfon? His ruling did not enable them to sell the merchandise at the highest price than the ruling of the sages rule. So the Gemara explained, samchu bashtut atzma. They initially rejoiced over a case of the disparity of 1/6 itself. The Rabbi Tarfon mechila u'Rabbanan olam. Because according to Rabbi Tarfon is a waiver of the disparity, and according to the sages, it is exploitation. Now, it's important to know that what we speak here is according to Rashi, because the situation, remember the case we use is a electric bicycle, just as an example, we used earlier, that instead of charging 1,000, he charged 1,150. So even apparently is pachot mishtut, is less than 1/6. But the purchaser comes in and he says, you know what, I want to nullify the deal. I don't like the way he behaved, I don't want to do any business with him. That option is not available in this case, in less than 1/6. 1/6 and you can go out or more and said goodbye, the deal is nullified. If it's less than that, it's a different story, you can. So, what Rabbi Tarfon said so far? If it's 1/6 and less, then the waiver is immediately. If it's between more than 1/6 up to 1/3, is exploitation, and the one who's being exploited, he is the one who rules. If it's more than 1/3, then the deal nullified, and both parties can renege. According to the sages, less than 1/6, it's immediate waiver. If it's 1/6 is exploitation, and the one who's been exploited, he's the one who rules. If it's more than 1/6, the deal is nullified. Meaning that if it's less than 1/6, according to both Rabbi Tarfon and the sages, the waiver applies immediately. If it's more than 1/6 up to 1/3, according to the merchants of law, follow originally the view of Rabbi Tarfon. There is no difference between Rabbi Tarfon and the sages in regards to the time frame that the purchaser can change his mind. Only it's come to the point when, according to Rabbi Tarfon, the one who has been exploited is the one who rules. And according to the sages, both parties can change their mind. It's important to know also, it's a little tiny bit vignette of Kabbalah. There is a story of Rabbi Mordechai Chernobyl Zatzal. It's a great Hasidic Rebbe. So, in one of his statements, he said that when we said on ad a shtut, the level of exploitation is up to 1/6. So he said if you go by the Kabbalistic chart of the midot, that the 6 is the midat hayesod, is the essence. It's midat hakdusha, and therefore he said the person should la'avod al atzmo, that work on himself, that if he guard himself, you can know for sure if he is a man of yirat shamayim, of fear of God, and that's what he explained Kabbalistically, the idea of the difference of shtut, or less than shtut, or more than shtut. But anyway, it's the whole concept of sfirat yesod. Ibaylu, let's continue. Bitul mikach lerabanan. So the question, the dilemma raised before the sages, when it's come to nullification of the transaction, according to the sages, le'olam chozer, may one always renege the transaction, או דילמה בכדי שיראה לתגר או לקרובו. Or you can say that a person can renege only the time that he's taking to show the merchandise or to a merchant or a relative, and that's only the framework of time, which we said earlier, let's say half an hour. ואם תמצא לומר כדי שיראה לתגר או לקרובו, מה יקבל שטות ליתר על שטות? If you tell me that the only time frame is that he should show a merchant or a relative, what's the difference between 1/6 then greater than 1/6? So the Gemara explained, yes, it is different. Ika, דאילו בשטות משנית ענה חוזר, ואילו ביתר על שטות שניהם חוזרים. That if it's 1/6, then the one who exploited can renege on the transaction. While in the case of the disparity is greater than 1/6, both of them can renege on the transaction. Mai. So, what's the halacha? Tosfot challenged the whole concept. He says, what are you basically saying? That someone who is greater in number and dishonest gain more? There's a general discussion among the early sages. Trace a situation just using an example. Someone sold an etrog in the super overprice. Sold it for $1,500 instead of, much less. He goes to the buyer and he said, you know what? Give me back the etrog, I'll give you back the money. So Rabbi Moshe said, if the buyer is not complaining, there's nothing to... But others say that since the mekach lo kayam klal, since the whole deal is void, then what exactly the fulfillment of mitzvah and what exactly happens here. But anyway, that's the whole ma'alach here. What the meaning? Ma'aram Shif, you see it's also in the Ritva. It said that if you tell me that mechila bepachot mikdei hona'ah, that the level of waiver I'll apply immediately in less than the level of minimum exploitation, tashma, come and see from Mishnah, chazru l'divrei chachamim. What we said at the merchant of Lord, they went back from the ruling of Rabbi Tarfon to the ruling of the sages, that the purchaser have a time to renege the entire day. If you tell me that the nullification of the transaction, the purchaser can renege בכדי שיראה לתגר או לקרובו until he showed to a merchant or his relative, ולרבי טרפון כל היום, and according to Rabbi Tarfon he can renege the entire day, משום הכי חזרו. So now you tell me that that's the reason that they changed their mind, the merchant of Lod, meaning according to Rabbi Tarfon, you have mechila lealtar. According to the sages, the one who purchased, the time that he can change is, let's say, half an hour until he show it to another merchant or his relative. Ela yamar bitul mikach leRabbanan leolam chozer. But if you tell me the nullification of the deal according to the sages, he can always renege. Why the merchants of Lord go back to the ruling of the sages? Rabbi Tarfon ichalut fei, דקמא משווה לו הוא הנאה כל היום ותו לא. So according to Rabbi Tarfon, it's preferable to the merchants of Lord because he deems such a disparity of exploitation and rule that one can claim nullification of the transaction for the entire day and more, which is more beneficial to the merchant. So the more rejected said, bitul mikach lo shachiach. The nullification of the transaction is uncommon. And consequently, the merchant of law did not take that rule into consideration when calculating which ruling was most advantageous to them. So, in short, you can have three different avenues to understand the story of the merchant of Lord why initially, they are rejoicing and happy with the ruling of Rabbi Tarfon, and why they changed their mind and went the view of the sages. One, that you go by less than 1/6 according to the sages, and according to Rabbi Tarfon is less than 1/3. Ein mechila le'altar, that is no immediate waiver. So originally the merchant of Lod was happy that Rabbi Tarfon was lenient with them, that the seller doesn't have to renege up to 1/3, but only claim that the portion of the exploitation need to return. And therefore, since they heard later on that the time that the purchaser can claim is for the entire day, and not the sages that said until the only time is like half hour until he showed the another relative or another merchant. Now, this type of understanding we can go if the nullification of the deal can one renege forever, versus if it's a limit time that he can change his mind. According to the sages, it's only time that he can half an hour show to a relative or merchant. According to Rabbi Tarfon, is the whole day. Now, there's another avenue to understand that less than shtut, than 1/6, according to everyone, is a waiver immediately. And when it's come to nullification of the transaction, which is more than 1/6 the sages, and more than 1/3 according to Rabbi Tarfon, can renege forever. So according to Rabbi Tarfon, from 1/6 to 1/3, including 1/6 itself, that exploitation, the same way as 1/6 according to the sages. And originally, the merchant of Lud were happy when Rabbi Tarfon was lenient, when he said it is 1/3 is nullification of the deal. But when it comes to exploitation, since he circumscribed, he limit the time return of exploitation, that is only the time of Lichdei Sheira'eh, that he can show it half an hour to another merchant or to his relative. So therefore, they changed the mind when he elaborated and explained to him, Rabbi Tarfon, that it's applied to the entire day. Now, the third avenue to understand this is when it's come to the sages, if it's less than 1/6, you can renege and waive immediately. And according to Rabbi Tarfon, even in 1/6, it's you can waive immediately, and from 1/6 to 1/3, you have the dinei ona'ah, you have the law of exploitation. Now, it's important that you have here, for those who want to go a little advanced, there is a Ktsot HaChoshen that deal here with Ta'anat Migo. Netivot HaMishpat have expand on the idea of Ta'anat Migo. You see it in Aruch HaShulchan, in Machane Ephraim. Machane Ephraim in general explain that the behavior of people is very interesting. Let's say you have a basic item, let's say bread, milk, let's say a fixed price, okay? And if he add to that, so they potentially can have bitul mekach, can have nullification of the deal. But Aruch HaShulchan said the way we should go is to go by rov chanuyot, we go by the majority of the merchant, and if he adds more than the average fixed price of the most of the merchant, then you can have a bitul mekach. Amar Rava, Hilcheta, derived from here, the halachic resolution. Pachot mishtut, if it's less than 1/6, nikna mekach, the merchandise is acquired immediately. If the disparity is greater than 1/6, yoter al shtut, bitul mekach, either party can demand nullification of the transaction. Shtut, if the disparity is precisely 1/6, the buyer has acquired the merchandise, and the one who benefited from the exportation returns the sum gained by the exportation. Shtut kana umachzir honah, veze, and both claim nullification of the transaction and return of some gain, בכדי שיראה לתגר לקרובו, within the time that it takes to show the merchandise to the merchant or to his relative. סיוע, תניא עקבתי דרבא, ציטור the Braita according to view of Rabbah, הונאה פחות משטות נקנה מכך. If in case of exportation, if the disparity is less than 1/6, the merchandise is acquired immediately. יתר על שטות בטל מכך, if the disparity is greater than 1/6, the transaction is nullified. Shtut, if the disparity is precisely 1/6, the buyer has acquired the merchandise, kana umachzir honah divrei Rabbanatan, and the one who benefited from the exploitation returns the sum gained by the exploitation. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Omer, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, when it's come to na'at shtut, in the case where the seller was exploited, yad mocher alei, the seller is an advantage. רוצה אומר לו, תן לי מקחי, if he wishes he reneged the transaction and said, give me my merchandise, או תן לי מה שעיניתני, or give me some of you gain by exploiting me. וזה, and one may claim both the nullification of the transaction and the return of some gain, בכדי שיראה לתגר לקרובו, within the time that he can show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative. So there is a discussion in the poskim, just as a conclusion point. You go to stores and you see a big sign, end of season sale, half a price to 75% below the price. Now the truth of the matter, some of the items are really in a lost price. You have here stores that go by chain. I give you an example. It's a well-known that Nordstrom. They have another store that's called Nordstrom Rack, I think, right? And any leftover from the seasons go to the other store at much less. And in some cases they go, for example, to Marshall's, and over there it's even leftover. So the thing is, the problem is that sometimes it's a setup. You go to some stores and they set up, let's say, small grocery store. You need to buy bread, milk, so they make sure that it's a very back of the store. So you pass through other things with the hope that you buy things. Now, here's the thing. If you have a spot that's written clearance and the person hide within the clearance things that it's not really part of the clearance, so that for sure it's the violation. But many times you walk out of a store and you say to yourself, wait a second, I walk in because I thought everything is so cheap, but it turns out that I get 1, 2, 3, 4 is cheap, but 5, 6, 7, 8 was much higher. So how you treat it? You treat it as a package, or you treat it each part of the item or each part of the clothing separately? How exactly, how exactly you calculate, evaluate exploitation? Here you go by the sach hakniya, by the entire purchase item, or you go by each and every item. It's a discussion among the poskim, and as we said, those who wish, there is so much more to discuss on this sugiyot. There is a extensive writing on the Aruch HaShulchan, obviously the Ktsot and Netivot, and much more.